It's working? Yeah. Is the microphone working? Yeah. Good. Perfect. Okay. So thank you very much for this introduction. I'm very delighted to be here today to present this keynote on spatial strategies for sustainable communities in downtown areas. And I also would like to express my gratitude for the Ministry of Housing and Urban Planning for inviting me and for the great hospitality we have been experiencing the last days. This keynote is structured very simply. I would like to introduce myself, I think, first, so that you also understand the perspective, because it's more connected to academic research, but also to connected to a consulting experience in the region. I would also like to then formulate some breakout questions before I introduce some hypotheses, and then going into downtown struggles globally and also regionally for regeneration to integrate housing for sustainable communities. Also introducing one of our latest consulting projects in Qatar's capital, Doha. So just few words to myself. I'm the co-course director of our Masters in Sustainable Urban Design. So I'm an architect, but I have a PhD in urban planning. So I'm looking at housing and urbanism from an integrated development perspective to create more livable neighborhoods, working in the research mainly also with urban economists on the various difficult challenges ahead of us in and also reinventing cities to a large extent. I'm also the chair of a housing group for the RIBA, and we are looking at topology mixes, densification in certain areas for more affordability. So I would also like to share that I am also reconnecting to the region. I'm also very happy to be back because the origins of my academic research with University of Stuttgart and a PhD was based here and looking at the urban transformation of Bahrain in the 2000s. So I'm very happy to be back in the Kingdom of Bahrain and to share some research and some consulting experience. When we look at the breakout questions, downtowns worldwide are struggling because of economic transformations. Housing can be a solution, but we have to also define what communities we want to have inhabiting downtown areas and co-producing the new downtowns as communities, as sustainable communities. So I would also like to introduce that citation from the urban economist, the American urban economist Edward Glaeser. Downtowns need to be places where people can interact, exchange ideas, and build social connections, which are essential for economic growth and social cohesion. So this is something where we can also ask ourselves, how much do we actually in our daily lives engage with downtown areas? And I myself have to also admit that I might visit a downtown area in Nottingham maybe once or twice a month. So there is a lack of interaction now, and it's increasing. And this also led to the decline of retail, decline of commercial activities in downtown areas. At the same time, we have also no integration of diverse communities in downtowns. This can be also underlined with the city I'm living in at the moment in Nottingham, between London and Manchester. As you can see, all the green areas are bachelor living situations, temporary living, mainly student accommodations, of course, in Nottingham. We have an urban population, the agglomeration of 1 million inhabitants. And all the families are, of course, pushed out into the outskirts, always further away for affordability to get their detached or attached housing typology supplied. And at the same time, the city center, the downtown areas are declining, retail is not working, the death of the high street as we know it is continuing, and shopping malls are failing. So a shopping mall recently also got demolished with the big hopes to get at least office investment, like commercial investment into new offices, but they were never arriving. So now Homes England basically bought up that land to provide 1,000 social housing units right in the center of the city, at the entrance where the main station is. So quite a controversial project, quite interesting, however, in the sense of the reflection of where we are right now in the UK. The downtowns are in that situation. We have rising demand in affordable housing, and at the same time, we have downtowns which became quite difficult to develop. So when we look at sustainable communities, what are sustainable communities? From an ecological, environmental standpoint, we want to reduce car dependency and commuting. So it is, of course, about transit-oriented development, but as well short distances, paths between homes and workplaces, public transit stops, possibly, and of course, all the different services, schools, and so on. At the same time, we want mixed communities. We don't only want low income, we want a mix. And London, for example, was very successful in integrating various social housing incentives and also having various families with different backgrounds living quite in proximity. So there are ways to do that, and I think it's important to not have monotypological big, massive scale interventions for just one particular income group. So it is about diversity. And at the same time, it is also about up-leveling public spaces, shared spaces, creating neighborhoods, because we lost these neighborhoods as typologies in that formation. And for that, when we have again the dwelling, the neighborhood, the district, we also create again a connection between people living and having a center, a shared place, where they can create again a marketplace, because also this is going lost, and this has created these Western consumerism and consumption societies where production is not as part of our daily lives anymore. So looking at the history of downtown developments in the Gulf region, we can distinguish four main phases. Of course, you have the traditional vernacular settlement with the souk. And then we had the nation building, the modernization phase with the first planning, the big infrastructure, the car was introduced. And then we had the international hubs being connected also then, especially also here in Bahrain, with banks arriving and with business arriving and also being connected to international airports. And then we had the investment hubs, the property-led development with international investors coming into the property markets. So all this affected the downtown quite dramatically. So if you look at the vernacular settlement here in Manama, for example, you have the port, the souk next to it, and then you have the different Farij neighborhoods all connected. So the marketplace was something in the daily life where people interacted as a public space, and you had a high level of privacy going into your neighborhoods and also being connected to the countryside. So when the modernization started, land reclamation started in the Kingdom of Bahrain. At the same time, the new highways enabled suburban living, different kind of living forms, modern living forms. And that is, of course, completely understandable. This modern urbanization, electricity, water, and AC have, of course, had a massive impact on lifestyles and urbanism. And at the same time, the business district was zoned along the northern shoreline of Manama towards the international airport in Muharraq. And we have first master plans of Hammertown in the 80s being then developed. In the 80s, we also had the arrival of banking, also international regional banking, which was a big driver in the economic diversification of the Kingdom of Bahrain. And the business district was more and more defined along the shoreline with the entrance to the traditional settlement with Bab al-Bahrain. However, the south was purely residentially zoned with neighborhoods and districts set up to be developed. What, however, happened then in the 2000s was the opening up of so-called investment zoning. And the investment zoning, as you can see here in orange with BA and BB, enabled commercial and residential developments depending on market needs. The moment the Kingdom of Bahrain also opened up for freehold property markets, for big mega projects and developments, creating this new skyline. At the same time, we have, of course, a lot of need for other kind of housing typologies, for all the kind of guest workers coming into the country, developing this construction boom in all different areas. At the same time, we also had a much bigger demand in offices, for example, for all these different companies arriving. And that meant that the downtown, the business district, was not contained anymore. So it spread, it basically also fragmented the southern area with various different areas. And that is very typical in Gulf cities, creating key challenges now. The downtown is much bigger now. So as also it got bigger from the souk to the CBD, it got also, again, much bigger and much more sprawling in the last 20 years. So if you look at downtown areas, downtowns are always expanding, of course, with population size. So when we have now over 1 million inhabitants on the islands of Bahrain, this is of course the case here as well. So we have a problem often with this fragmentation and fast growth, that there's missing integration, especially if it is transit-led. So it is not led by public transportation, but by car. And you can imagine that you have to invest somewhere where you have still infrastructure and access and where you can park. So this is a natural process of fragmentation because it is car-based. So at the same time, this lack of infrastructural capacities and incremental development led also to some areas being quite deteriorating, underutilized areas. We can say that land prices are quite high because they are central. At the same time, we have this underutilization of land, of the return of that land. The same actually happening also in other cities worldwide. So this is a general struggle, a general problem for redevelopment. So we also did studies in Qatar's capital, Doha, as you can see with Space Syntax. So the Al Saad district is also now part of that downtown, jumping from Ring A to Ring B, C, and D. In that area now we have, as you can see, the street network. Warm colors and red means high levels of integration, easy accessibility. And green and blue colors means low integration, less accessibility, less movement as a result. And you can see that the inside, the core of the district, has a low integration level, which means, and which also suggests, that the previous suburban road grid does not cater and integrate all this high densification. So what happened is that previous low-rise compound typologies in suburban housing were replaced by high-density commercial buildings, office buildings, but also apartment buildings, of course, with over 20 to 30,000 inhabitants in the Al Saad district. At the same time, with our surveys and interviews, we saw that the residents are still on average commuting more than 20 kilometers by car. So meaning they have no interaction on a neighborhood level. They would not identify a neighborhood. They would also not identify a district. So there is a disconnection, a disintegration of communities in downtown areas, meaning then also coffee shops and other kind of amenities and services, and also the upgrading of public spaces is difficult, because once you need cars, cars will be everywhere. And that means that public spaces are too occupied by this private transportation mode. So regeneration frameworks are needed in these areas to find new solutions in hand with transit-oriented development. Identifying districts and their neighborhoods is the first job to really understand, okay, what neighborhoods can we build, what are there, in order to understand then the relationship from dwelling to neighborhood to district to city. At the same time, we have to strengthen these centralities and connect them. We have to also create new typologies, mixed typologies for better density balances. And we also have to create this new form of urban living we want, also for the actual economic diversification, which has to happen. Young entrepreneurialism, small, medium enterprises, that the young national population can also start to innovate and to create these new economies for the future, which was always the plan also here in the economic development vision for the Kingdom of Bahrain. So when we look at the case for Al Jadida and Al Ranim, we were commissioned by the Ministry of Municipality and Environment. Makawa Architects London got that contract, and we got the subcontract as the local architects and planners, ARIS. We were registered at that time in Qatar's capital. At the moment, we're only based in Chicago. So when we are looking at the situation, we have a huge area of 60 hectares with over 200 different landowners. The situation was there was a clear announcement by the government of Qatar that they will not continue buying these land plots. The land price was about the same as downtown Chicago. And we had the situation that there was so much competition between landowners and the developments were so incohesive, incremental, and not incompatible that there was a huge issue there. Also with a lot of land speculation next to metro stations where normally the densification and the better topologies should happen. So quite a tricky project to start with. And even trickier because Qatar Foundation with Musharraf had a president next to us, which was a complete replacement, like an ad hoc replacement of a complete district overnight, basically, in a couple of years, mixed use and so on. But of course, high investment profile with actually not the urban densities you would expect from a population perspective. Yeah, so we have high build densities, but not the high population densities. The population densities were much higher in zone 15 and 16. But looking in the area and the history of that area, it was desert in the 50s, but it became part of the area of the suburbs for Qatari housing in the 1960s. And with people moving from countryside to the city, to Doha, they were used to a certain vernacular way of living with courtyards. And so they were actually in the 1960s still building the vernacular style of housing with courtyards connected with that density. But in the 70s, housing programs by the government of Qatar enabled this population to move into the outskirts. And this led to the starting point of renting these dwellings to guest laborers, first families, and in the last 20, 30 years to a transit, mainly male labor migrant community living in this area, quite in high densities, and also because there's hardly any investment getting into that building stock with very difficult situations, infrastructurally, utility-wise, and so on. So looking at the area and the plan, the first thing we did was trying to connect it to the national planning framework to connect places. So this is the first thing you always try to start with. How can we activate the area by better connection, by better linkage? We knew that the metro station in the south is under construction. So we had that big opportunity here coming in for transit-oriented development. The next step is, of course, an open space strategy, try to create open spaces, also green spaces in certain areas in order to foster these kind of walkability areas and to promote walking to train stations and so on. The next step, we worked with the Qatar Museum Authority in saving certain building stock, like historical building stock, even though built in the 60s, there's still a narrative, there's still a story here on the site, which should not just be replaced because it is still part of the whole legacy of these districts, and they can be renewed, recovered, and integrated. So looking further, however, we were, of course, in that situation that a lot of investment interest is still there in the area, especially with the metro station coming in. So certain opportunity sites we had to look at in order to create then these more dense areas with mixed use approaches, but also mainly residential in order to have then these other kind of areas being built up while also negotiating and integrating the older building stock. So all this is, of course, translated then in certain typologies and also how the typologies can work to have higher, medium, and low, and that negotiation between the different building heights. Then, of course, you show the before and after situations in order to try to create joint ventures between the different landowners. This is the most difficult part because these landowners, to a large extent, are not connected often. So they also have to get to know each other. They have to build relationships. They have to build a faith into the whole project. So the government only was ready to build the public spaces, to build the connection points in certain infrastructures. But the private sector had to come together and has to still come together in large parts to build then these joint ventures, to build, for example, that entrance situation, but also like the townscape in general with all these opportunity sites needs, of course, a lot of communication between all the different stakeholders. So the insight and also creating this more traditional way of living, and I'm very happy and to see also here with Moharak, with the project in Moharak, also showcasing that native living back to the roots, back to urban living can happen and can be also a very qualitative way of life. So this is also something we wanted to promote in Qatar with various studies and these illustrations. So the key takeaways, it's all about communication, building relationships, and that's the most difficult part, because for a long time there was always this situation and relationship to land in the sense of revenue, rather than that quality has to be co-created. Yeah, so that what we also discussed yesterday. So the shared public realm is something we can only create when we connect buildings, but not seeing every land in our own portfolio disconnected. So at the same time, we have to create this connection also for creating economic diversification, because in all our studies we show, and this is why London and other places are so successful, is that if you want to have creative industries emerging and you want that diversification, giving young people that ownership of an economy rising, you need the space for it. You need these small little places where offices can emerge. In London, you will see architectural firms on street side where previous shops were. So you have now suddenly a very different language of co-working spaces and so on, co-creating these industries. And these are things which are desperately needed in the future. So we're talking about, of course, a long projection of 20 years. So this is not a project which is going to be built over the next years as Musharraf. It's a long-term goal project. This project led then also to be commissioned for the Qatar Urban Design Compendium. So we also worked again with Mekawa architects on this coding of like looking at regulations out of all the studies we did to look at for the whole of Qatar to certain kind of standards, also new typologies and climatic responses of how downtown living is possible in also new shapes and forms. So the call to action is, of course, based on these kind of results, looking at typology studies, being more in an understanding that creating small enterprises and incentives needs space, needs downtowns, needs these social interactions and points. Once you are in the outskirts and you have a consumerist lives, as myself also at the moment, I have that in Nottingham, we often don't co-create anymore so much. We don't go into these entrepreneurial relationships as much because our social interaction is shrinking. So we have to rediscover this, and we also rediscover new tools. At the moment, we are working on a site, Island Quarter in Nottingham, also with Space Syntax. This is owned by an American landowner, and the land speculation has been going on for a very long time. So the whole area is stuck. So we are all in the same boat here across countries, and everywhere we have the same issue. So we are looking here in that situation. Again, it's very high land prices, so the densities have to go up. They are suggesting at least 1,600 housing units. So we are basically trying to negotiate different typologies. We are looking in Europe at the moment a lot at the so-called open courtyard typologies, so that courtyards are private but not gated. So they are connected to the public realm, and also with Space Syntax, we're showing that with the blue areas in the courtyards that the privacy can be maintained while you also create shared spaces where then the social interaction can be fostered, the neighborhood can be formed, connect to the district, connect to the city, and then also creating active frontages, co-working spaces, and spaces for little offices to emerge and people starting to work in these creative parts. This is also part of the so-called creative quarter in Nottingham. And these are things which are also needed here in the region to create and to foster these new places. And we also do a lot of typology studies for Homes England, looking at the different densities here in Vienna, for example. How big are the shared spaces? How many people are actually sharing? And newest brain research also suggests that most people can actually memorize around 100 to 200 faces because there's a threshold in density. So if you integrate, for example, too much density in one place, like more than 200 people, you will be surrounded by strangers. You will see always a new face every day, and you will feel not that comfort and that kind of privacy you would expect. When you have too low density, you have hardly any social interaction on your daily life, especially if it's car-based. And in that case here, what we have now in Vienna and Copenhagen and lots of different typology trends, we always have around 150 to 200 people sharing courtyards, sharing places with great success. So we have also been working, that's actually one of my projects with Albert Speer partner in Germany, looking at how density can be achieved. We have here 1,000 housing units. We did all the studies with the city council and then creating a design competition for architects to compete. A Swiss architect won the competition. We did the master planning for it. It's completely car-free, transit-oriented with a metro station also already being built. And you can see the density is, from a pedestrian perspective with 7-8 floors manageable, at the same time having these private or more private courtyards for kids to play. And what I also would like to stress as an architect is that materiality and exploring more innovation in materiality can be a key factor when we densify, when we create these densities in shared places, because that is also something which gives character. Here in this region, working, for example, with ramped earth, working with local materials, create opportunities to create a language which is more rooted in that land and which connects people also more. Modular design, another aspect. One thing I would also like to stress, because we're exploring a lot in Germany right now, in Berlin, with the new cooperative model. Cooperatives are opportunities for not being tenant and having this landlord situation, and also not being owner, property owner, but to actually go into a joint venture in a cooperative where you build together housing. And this is quite successful, but it needs, of course, a lot of contractual setting up. And so I would like to end with the keynote with a quote from Martin Heidegger, the German philosopher. Dwelling is not simply about inhabiting a physical space, but about the way we relate to our world, including our relationships with nature, culture, and others. So thank you very much for listening. Are there any questions? No? Are there?
Thank you very much for your interesting lecture in regards to the urban renewal of several cities at the Gulf, at the Arabian Gulf. Actually, our urban renewal program here. First, if you allow me, I will introduce myself. My name is Faik Al-Mandil. I was the former urban planning undersecretary, and right now I'm a consultant at the same field. I get my diploma in urban design from the same university you got it, Nottingham Institute of Planning. Actually, in Bahrain, we started the program of urban renewal very early. It was in early 1980s, and it started with road widenings. And with the time that we experiment the practice that we did in the Ministry of Housing at that time, we find out that the road widening is not the solution for preserving the traditional areas. So we changed our policy at that time, and we went to hire a program to preserve the traditional cities of Manama and Muharraq especially, and then with the urban structure of the villages. Actually, in the other Gulf areas, they went to a program which is, we call it as, redevelopment program. It is not a preservation program, but what we are looking here and the wishes of our government that we have to create the city. That means that we have to preserve the heritage of the city. We have to preserve the urban structure and fabric of that cities. And at the same time, we have to modernize the city to meet the requirements of the new generation. The innovation of these policies for recreating the traditional cities is to find the solutions how we can develop or redevelop or preserve the historical buildings and historical forage, what we call it here, by introducing the new ways of programs that we get use of that cities. Nowadays, our traditional cities is inhabitants by the non-Bahraini expats, which is there is really a complete restructure, social restructure of that cities. What we are looking for is that we have to see that how we can bring re-inhabitant the Bahrainis to these cities. This is the most important things by creating socio-economic activities, by changing the form of the architecture, by looking for the rules and regulation in order to preserve these cities. I believe we have to treat these cities in a special manner of finding a way and a new philosophy for these cities. At the same time, we have to keep the heritage of that one as a tourist area for attract cities for the tourists in that area. Maybe you live in some of our Gulf cities here. You find that there is some cities you can visit it. For example, if you take Doha, you can go for Suq Waqf only. You can feel that the heritage of the area is through Suq Waqf. Suq Waqf is created in a way of a traditional souk, but it wasn't exist before. It's enlarged in the same concept of the old cities. While we in Bahrain here, we have Muharraq, Manama, we have Qaisariya Souk, we have the other things, all these things, we have it originally. It's need only to have little bit of a treatment and a little bit of tailoring to meet the requirement of the tourism and the heritage. So I think I'm expecting from you to give us new ideas of how we can approach these areas as a academic and at the same time as a consultant. Also to tackle the social dilemma of these cities. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. I think there's no easy solution. I think what I learned from the project with the Ministry of Municipality and Environment in Qatar is that as long as there is a certain need and there's a certain land return by, for example, building certain housing for guest laborers, or like also not actually building new, but just using that building stock for guest laborers coming in for these transitory societies, which are really temporary. As long as you have that condition and there is not another supply for that matter for these kind of laborers, and also there is still that kind of need, downtown areas will struggle to be transformed, to be honest. So I think that the incentive here is a contractual matter between landowners, and that the government can give them the confidence that public space investments and renewal investments and support can arrive in a certain situation, so that there can be a platform for that negotiation and support if the incentives come from an agreement and a joint venture agreement between the different landowners. And this is a new culture. This is a new way, because for a long time you build and they will come. Basically, you build, you supply, and there will be a return. So now these areas, we call that investment gridlock. So certain areas are not yielding the return anymore. They're underutilized. The land price is too high. We have the same in certain parts in Beijing or certain other areas. This is really not just a Gulf city phenomenon. So the return is not there. So you either keep it as a private asset, which doesn't give you return. This can also be what the US, for example, is tackling, is then having certain taxation. So then you don't also want to even keep that piece of land because of the taxation. So this is another alternative solution to speed up the process. So this is what the US is doing in certain cities, so that the land value tax is introduced. And that means that it pushes private landowners to see their land in a different perspective, and that they have to collaborate, because it is not anymore about competition, the competition between these individual landowners, but it's about collaboration, so that they create connections with each other and saying we can come together, we make that development happen, and that actually then gets the government on board with better infrastructure, with better public spaces, connections, and so on. So I think that it's probably a slow transformation. It's not going to be overnight, as said, because it's an awareness situation to see that downtown area, first of all, as downtown area for a long time, because it was so quick. You know, we're talking about 20, 30 years of rapid urban growth. And so a lot of these areas are locally often not perceived as downtown mixed areas. They are mixed and they are part of the downtown now, but they're often, because in the 90s they were still seen as suburbs, they're not yet perceived as that, you know. So I think there's many things about perception, awareness, negotiations, communications, and this is why we also share these things as architects, because we want to look as you're also a consultant and planner. Sometimes you're not only consulting projects to happen in the next 2 years. Sometimes we have to look at 20 years, you know. So it is something more future oriented in many ways.
Thank you very much. Just I would like to add one point, if you
please.
allow me. When you start your presentation here, you start with Nottingham downtown, which is inhabited and used by the students, more or less by the students. I think if we go in that directions in the Gulf cities here, by creating the as you know now, the Gulf, there is a lot of private universities and governmental universities. If we try, just a suggestion or an idea I was thinking of, bringing this university to the downtown here by creating let's say the a little bit of adjustment to accommodate this university, and then to create the residents of that traditional areas by the students themselves. Do you think it will help to revive the cities, revive these areas?
I think to a certain extent, yes. I think that young people are always generators. I think in our case, Nottingham is slightly different because we are talking about a student population of 70,000. So then we have again this very mono, you know, we have almost a population which is again temporary, transitory, and again not creating necessarily neighborhoods because they have a very different attachment to the place. But I think integrating young people, we'd always basically also try to emphasize is always to integrate different communities and young people are certainly like also getting to know, and this life, this urban life, this urbanism can be, of course, a very good idea, like also here for that region, to connect people more to that lifestyle and to use the metro. I just came from Riyadh, for example, and I was surprised how many national citizens are using the metro now. So it is a very big part of their daily life now. And a lot of people, also Western consultants, always projected and forecasted that the metro will not be accepted by locals and so on. And it's not true. Yeah. So people are very much, and especially young generations, are very much up to save time and not be in traffic congestion, and to have the convenience and also the savings of not having to spend too much on mobility, you know. So I think that transit-oriented approaches are very critical also for these areas in many downtowns, in many places. Okay, is there another question? Or should we? Is it? Okay. Thank you. شكرا. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Weidman, for this great keynote speech. I would like to invite Mrs. Fatma Al-Mannai, the Undersecretary of the Ministry of Housing and Urban Planning, to honor our speaker. إذن السيدات والسادة الحضور، نواصل جدول أعمالنا مع جلسة نقاشية تركز على دور الأطر التشريعية والتنظيمية في إنجاح مشروعات الإسكان الاجتماعي. تتناول هذه الجلسة أهمية صياغة سياسات فعالة تستند إلى تشريعات واضحة وقابلة للتطبيق مع استعراض أفضل الممارسات لتجسير الفجوة